Okay. Okay, everybody, we're starting. Sorry about that. I hope everybody gets this. This is a weird beginning because I forgot my reading glasses, my computer glasses, so I can't see. I might push everything off of your desk. Okay, hello. All right, so we are, no problem, Toby. I'm really sorry that the regular Zoom is not working. I hope everybody got the message. Okay, 1 second. I am recording. Okay, great. So we're going to take a little bit of a diversion to talk about, oh, I can see everybody though. I just can't see my computer. Thank you, Danielle, for the muffins, for the, it's a happy birthday to me and Amira, even though our birthday, when is Samira's birthday?
It was Shabbat.
Oh, okay, and mine is on Shabbat, so we're exactly a week apart. And yay, exactly, and a Shavuot. A good segue into this today's shir, and these beautiful flowers from Danielle's garden, right?
Wow.
So I'm taking half. Okay. Okay. Oh, I'm glad people are getting this code. Good. Okay, great. I just let someone else in. For some reason, it's making me admit people. All right, so let's get started. Let me just share my screen.
The elephant in the room with me.
Go ahead. Start.
Okay. So,
And this is going to tie into what we're talking about today.
yeah, sorry. Make sure my phone wasn't going to go warning off again. That it wasn't a bad thing when somebody was destroyed, and that it shouldn't be rebuilt. So I'm just going to put that elephant out there. Say that again.
Do we need a third temple? Was it a bad thing that it was that the second temple was destroyed, and maybe it was a good thing for the Jewish people in the long run? Do we
the deaths of the people, of course?
Yes. Do we earnestly pray for the return of the temple? So this is something, obviously it's a really good question, because it's like it kind of underlies everything that we are talking about. So I think it also connects to Shavuot in an interesting way, because we're going to talk about Shavuot today, because Laura and I talked about this last week, and when I looked at Shavuot as a holiday, and I'm sure you have all like kind of looked into what is Shavuot about? I've heard shirim about it. So today we're going to just look at some of the historical sources. And I think we're going to come back to Laura's question about what was the role of the temple. But it's essentially goes beyond the temple, right? It goes to the role of the state, which is a very, can Judaism be, can you be Jewish without a state, without a temple? And what are the most important aspects of Judaism? And I think that Shavuot kind of encapsulates all of that, because that's what underlies the question. So let's start with what?
Big questions.
Big questions. We're not going to tackle it all today, especially since I'm 12 minutes late. Okay. And I can't see. So, but let's start with source number 1 from the sources I sent over for today, May 24th. And we're going to start with a few questions. What is the purpose of Shavuot? What is Shavuot? What is it celebrating? Okay, so what is Shavuot celebrating? Is it an anniversary of something? Like we have a lot of anniversaries in Judaism. What is it the anniversary of? And when should it be celebrated? Okay, so the first source you will all recognize, because if you count the Omer, this is what you say every night when you count the Omer, which I was saying up until last week. You know, how long can you go and whatever. It's okay. It's okay. Even though my Chabad app was reminding me every 5 minutes, I still couldn't manage it. So this is also the Torah reading, the Maftir reading for Shavuot. First, who can tell me what is the Torah reading? First, who goes to shul on Shavuot? You know, okay, good. So, what is the Torah reading for Shavuot? What is the What is the? No, it is from Shemot. What is it? Sorry, I didn't mean to stretch people's brains too much. Everybody's thinking about cheesecake. What do you think? Yes, thank you, thank you. The 10 Commandments. The 10 Commandments is the Torah reading for Shavuot. So from Yitro, exactly. So what does the Torah reading tell you about Shavuot? Why are we reading the 10 Commandments on Shavuot?
Because that's when we receive the Torah.
Because according to tradition, Shavuot is celebrating Zman Matan Toratenu, right? All through the davening on Shavuot. Of course, Shavuot is only one day, so it's hard to remember what additions we make. But in Birkat Hamazon, in Shachari, we always say Chag HaShavuot Zman Matan Toratenu. It's the time. It does not appear in the Chumash. So it's the time of the giving of the Torah. Now, what's interesting to point out is a few things before we dig into this Torah reading. Zman Matan Toratenu, that phrase describing Shavuot did not show up until the 9th century. Okay, that is really late. Nobody used that phrase. It doesn't show up anywhere in the Talmud. Shavuot as Zman Matan Toratenu, the time of the giving of the Torah. So bear that in mind, that addition in our Sidur is quite new. The second thing to bear in mind is that reading the 10 Commandments for anything outside of your son's bar mitzvah on Parshat Yitro, reading the 10 Commandments is actually a huge debate at all, not connected to Shavuot, is a huge debate in the Talmud. There's a machloket about whether you can get up randomly and read the 10 Commandments. And that is why there are some batei knesiot where if you're reading Parshat Yitro, when you get to the Aliyah for the 10 Commandments, you stand up. There's a minhag to stand up when we read the 10 Commandments, but that's a minhag. But there's a halacha that says if you're going to stand up at the beginning of the Aliyah, because it's demeaning to the rest of the Torah to only stand up for the 10 Commandments. So there's a lot of controversy about reading the 10 Commandments when it's not the Parsha. And in fact, there's a whole discussion in the Gemara about how you don't read the 10 Commandments on Shavuot. And then later at the Torah, there's a decision that you do. So that also is a late addition. This was the Torah reading. This is currently the maftir for Shavuot, which we're going to look at. So just really quickly, Ubiyom habikurim bihikrivchem mincha chadasha ladonai b'shvuatechem mikar kodesh yelechem kol melechet avodah lo tasu. On the first day of the first fruits, your feast of weeks, when you bring an offering of new grain to God, you shall observe a sacred occasion. You shall not work at your occupations. And then it gives a whole, I don't know why I included this. I don't think you would really care, but I also just because if you read through it, you see it's what we say every night when we're counting the Omer. So, and it's also the Torah reading for Shavuot. So what do we learn about Shavuot from this is, the only reason it's the maftir for Shavuot is because it's about Shavuot. Like if you ever pay attention to the maftirs for Pesach and for Sukkot, it's always about what was brought in the temple for those holidays. So with Shavuot, it's the same thing. So what do we learn about Shavuot from these psukim? You don't have to go through it to the end. I don't really care so much. It's Yom HaBikurim, right? So it's Yom HaBikurim. What are Bikurim? First fruits, exactly. So first fruits. It also has this b'Shavuotechem, your feast of weeks. Okay. So far it's not called Shavuot. It's just there's a reference to the weeks. Okay, there are many weeks. What else do we learn about Shavuot from this? It doesn't say that here, but from this pasuk, from this first pasuk, yeah, it says a mincha chadasha. In other words, it's going to be a special korban just for this day, and it's mikra kodesh, which means in our parlance, it's one of the shalosh regalim, right? There's Rosh Hashanah, there's Yom Kippur, they're kind of set aside, and then there's the shalosh regalim that are called mikra kodesh, that they are chagim. There are times when you don't do work, and they have like a status of Shabbat, okay, except you can cook and carry and all those other things. Okay, so that's our first Chag. So first of all, it's called Chag HaBikurim. It has some reference to weeks, a feast of weeks, and it's a Chag. Okay, that's all we know about it. And it seems to be one day, right? As opposed to Pesach and Shavuot that has a whole thing. What don't we know about Shavuot from this pasuk?
When it is.
When it is. I mean, every time we have Torah reading that refers to Pesach or refers to Sukkot, we know when it is. We know exactly what month and what day. And especially with Pesach, because we have the whole connection to the Korban Pesach. And the Korban Pesach is given right before the Chag. And so there's all sorts of discussion about, when that Korban Pesach is given. The fact is we have a lot of details about the two of the Shalosh Regalim and not about this one. Okay, so let's emphasize this with the second source. This is another, so Shavuot, just like Pesach and just like Sukkot, shows up in Shmot, it shows up in Dvarim, in Vayikra and Dvarim, as part of the Shalosh Regalim. Okay, so again, Shmot, Shalosh Regalim Tachog Li Bashana. For three times you should have, 3 times a year you should have a festival for me at Chag HaMatzot, Tishmor Shivat Yamim Tochal Matzot Kasher Tziviticha V'Moed Chadash Aviv Kivo Yatzata Mimitzrayim V'Lo Yar'u Pnei Rekam. So here, this is beautiful for Pesach, right? It doesn't tell you the date in this one, but it does tell you that Chag HaMatzot is 7 days. You should eat matzah just like I commanded you. And it's going to be in the spring because that's when you came out of Egypt and you did not find, and you should never come to me empty-handed. V'chag hakatzir, b'kurei masacha asher tizra b'sadeh, and chag hakatzir for celebrating a feast of the harvest. V'chag ha'asif, b'tzeit hashana ba'asvacha et masecha min hasadeh. And then you have the feast of ingathering at the end of the year, when you gather in the results of your work from the field. Okay, so what do we have in this passage? What do we learn? Bless you. What do we learn from this passage? We learn there are shalosh regalim. There's not one regel. There's 3 of them. We learn what they are, what we know of as Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot. We learn that Pesach has another name, Chag HaMatzot, which makes sense because there's matzah. And we learned that Chag HaMatzot is in the spring. And we also learned that that Chag HaMatzot is given a reason here. What's the reason for Chag HaMatzot? Because it's celebrating the Exodus from Egypt. And then we learned that Chag HaKatzir is when we bring in when we harvest the new fruits and the new wheat and all of those things that we planted in the field. So Chag HaKatzir, when is that happening? It's happening in the harvest time, which is, spring, summer. And then Chag HaAsif, B'tzeit HaShana. And then when all of the harvest has been brought in during the summer and everybody's, making their foods and preserving everything for the winter, that's when you have the celebration of the ingathering, which we commonly know as Sukkot, right? So what do we learn from these psukim? We learned that each of the chagim is attached to some sort of season, okay? And that they're, aside from Pesach, which is given a reason here, they all are very agrarian based, right? Like it's all based on if we didn't know, if the Torah didn't tell us when Pesach was and when Sukkot was, this would all make sense, right? Because you would celebrate these things when they happen. They don't happen on a specific day, right? Like except for Pesach, right? Except for Pesach in this description, that has to happen at a certain time, which is the anniversary of when you came out of Egypt. For Shavuot and for Sukkot, it's quite subjective, right? It depends on when you actually harvest your food and your crops and when you actually bring them in. So it would seem that the celebration of Chag HaAsif should be somehow correlated with the celebration of Chag HaKatzir, of when you harvest. And neither of them are that connected to Chag HaMatzot, to the Pesach holiday.
Sorry, I think the remarkable thing is how the calendar was organized. But Pesach is always in the spring, and
That's right.
Always in the fall, and yet a combination of lunar and stellar and whatever. Is unlike Ramadan, which can be at any.
Exactly. But that is the genius of the calendar that was only set into stone in some point, I think in the 3rd century, 2nd century or 3rd century, when Hillel Hakatan Hazaken, whatever, the direct descendant of Hillel and Rama Gamliel and all of them set the calendar. Otherwise, it was a Herculean effort to make sure that holidays were when they were supposed to be. And it wasn't an easy thing at all. And I want to come back to that because we're going to get into that. Because as you can see, the Torah is not really helping, right? The Torah is setting all 3 of the holidays as very agrarian, except for Matzot, except for Pesach, is setting it very much in a farmer's calendar rather than an objective calendar. Okay, which obviously makes sense in Mesopotamian society because that's how things were marked. Things were without electricity and without other kinds of occupations. Things were marked based on what was going on in the fields. So that it reflects a very biblical outlook. Now the other thing we learn about, as Sarah mentioned before, the other thing we learn about Shavuot is that it has another name. In the first in Bamidbar, we learned that it was Chag HaBikurim. Now we learned that it's Chag HaKatzir. Okay, so we have 2 names for it. Okay, now last source. We haven't gone through all the sources in the Torah, by the way, but this is the source. This is one of the sources that has caused the most grief for our understanding of Shavuot. Okay, Vayidaber Hashem. This is from Vayikra. This is source 3. Vayidaber Hashem el Moshe lemor, daber el bnei Yisrael v'armata lahem ki tavo el haaretz asher ani noten lachem uktzartem et ktsira ve'vetem et omer reshit ktsirchem el kohen. So God spoke to Moshe saying, speak to the people and say to them, when you get into the land that I am giving you and you reap the harvest, you shall bring the first of that harvest to the priest. The Kohen will lift it up and will give it to God on your behalf. And when does the Kohen do this? He does this mimacharat hashabbat. What is mimacharat hashabbat? Right, in our weekly calendar, that would be, we call that Sunday, right? The day of the Lord. Sorry. Anyway, so when does that Omer Korban happen? It happens sometime around. You didn't get the full picture here, but it happens Pesach, and on the day after the Shabbat of Pesach. That's when the Omer is brought. Okay, that's all we know. This Omer, it's like a Bikurim, but it's called Omer. Okay, and then it has a whole description of all the korbanot you bring with it. V'lechem v'kali v'karmel lo tochlu ad etzem hayom hazeh ari ve'echem et korban elokechem chukat olam l'doratechem b'chol mishvotechem. So this is how we get a hint that this is happening during Pesach, because it says until that very day, until you have brought the offering of your God, you shall eat no bread or parched grain or fresh ears. Corn ears or whatever ears. They didn't have corn in it, but whatever, not human ears. It is a law for all time throughout the ages in all your settlements. So this is a hint that whatever is happening here is happening during Pesach. Okay, the Omer Korban is brought during Pesach. Now, Usfartem lachem mimacharat hashabbat miyom haviachem et Omer tnufa sheva shebatot mimot tiena, and you shall count from the day after Shabbat until from the day that you bring the Omer. So you're supposed to bring this Omer the day after Shabbat. You're going to count these 7, you will count 7 weeks. Here's that mincha chadasha that you pointed out, right? So you're supposed to count 7 weeks. So it's mimacharat hashabbat, from the day after Shabbat, you count 7 weeks, and then that day, 50 days later, you then bring a korban, a mincha chadasha laHashem. What is that korban chadasha that we know of? That's Shavuot. But we have a real conspicuous absence here. We have a reference to Pesach, and we have a reference to counting. We don't know what day we're supposed to start counting. We don't know what this holiday is supposed to be at the end. It's somehow connected to this Omer, and it's really ambiguous what the Torah exactly is talking about. It's so different from the way that we describe other chagim that are on a specific day in a specific month. Here we have no indication of what the day is. We just have this phrase, mimacharat haShabbat. From the day after Shabbat, you're supposed to count 7 weeks. So that can make you crazy, right? Because like Sarah said, the calendar as we know it, we know exactly that Shavuot is supposed to be tomorrow night. Is tomorrow night Sunday, or let's say Friday? Is Friday Sunday? Like, how did it happen that we came to associate Shavuot with the 6th of Sivan? That's when Friday is. It's the 6th of Sivan. How did it become connected to a specific date in the calendar when the Torah is completely ambiguous about when it's supposed to happen? So does anybody have any ideas of how that happened or what happened?
They obviously interpreted Mimacharat HaShabbat as they considered Shabbat to be the first day of Pesach.
Or the second day of, yes, the day after the first day of Pesach, right? Mimacharat HaShabbat.
Shabbat, they're talking about the first day of Pesach. So Mimacharat HaShabbat is the next day. Presumably, that's how they interpreted it, and that's why we start counting on the second evening of Pesach. Beautiful explanation. And if we jump to source number 5, it turns out that you and Onkelos have something very much in common, because Onkelos is the Targum Aramaic. It's the Aramaic translation of the Torah, dates to the 1st century before the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. There's a lot of discussion about who Onkelos was. Was he a convert to Judaism? Was he a part of the later efforts to translate the Torah and the Septuagint, the translation of the 70? There's a whole lot of discussion about who this Onkelos was, but it was a very well-known translation, one of the earliest translations of the Torah into any other language, in this case Aramaic. Okay, so let's take out our Aramaic dictionaries so that we can understand how Onkelos translates umimacharat haShabbat. V'timnon lechon mi batar yoma tava. You should count for yourself from the day of when? How does he translate Shabbat here? Yoma tava, the day after Yom Tov. He does not translate it in it as Shabbat. He translates it in as the day after Chag. Miyom etuvechen yat darunta. Okay, then Shiva Shavuon Shlamim Yehevi. You should have 7 full weeks from that time. So he makes a very, and that's why people always say the moment you translate something, you're already giving a commentary. Onkelos here is giving a commentary, right? The pshat is Shabbat, Macharat HaShabbat, the day after Shabbat. Onkelos says it's the day after Yom Tov. So where does he get off doing that? So this Onkelos is tapping into one of the biggest debates that happens in the Gemara. We've already seen it in Masechet Brachot, Masechet Shabbat, Masechet Psachim. It comes up in Masechet Menachot, which I'm going to show you. And it is one of the ultimate distinctions between the Prushim, the Pharisees, the early predecessors of the rabbis, and the Sadducees, the Kohanic elite. Not only that, at the time of the destruction of the temple, or before the destruction of the temple, there were, I think, up to 5 different interpretations about when Shavuot should be celebrated. We know ultimately that the Prushim won that argument, and that is why today we celebrate it on the 6th of Sivan. But according to the Qumran sects, so those could be the Essenes and other people who were kind of living in the Qumran area near the Dead Sea, according to the scrolls that we have found, they celebrated on the 15th of Sivan. So they had a date, but they celebrated it on the 15th. According to the Talmud, we know that the Sadducees, so the Tzedukim, and the Bythusians, you remember the Bythusians, the Bitusin, who were related to the Sadducees, they celebrated it whenever they wanted to. They celebrated it according to the pshat of the text. They would take the Shabbat of Pesach, the day after Shabbat, the Sunday, and they would celebrate it 7 weeks later. So for them, there was not a specific, it was a little bit like Ramadan. It wasn't going to move around the calendar because Pesach was set, but it was always on a different date. The one thing that they did know, what day of the week would the Sadducees celebrate Shavuot, or did they claim Shavuot should be celebrated? Sunday. It was always Sunday, okay? But it could be any time. Hopefully in Sivan, it would still be in Sivan, but it could be multiple dates. The Beta Yisrael, the Ethiopians, who when they came to Israel, it turned out, were following the Sadducees because they left Israel after the destruction of the first temple, when it was clear there was still a tradition of celebrating Shavuot 7 weeks after the first Shabbat of Pesach, or whenever Shabbat was on Pesach. And so when the Ethiopians came here, they were celebrating it on the Sunday 7 weeks after the first day of Pesach. So we had a lot of different interpretations, and you can make a whole. I actually read a really interesting article. It's a little bit of a treif site, but I think you can get a lot of good things out of it. It's called Torah.com, and was started by what? The Torah.com. What that Zev Farber, local Zev Farber started, and he has a great article that kind of compounds the issue. And actually gives you a chart as to what was going on. But that's only one issue, right? The dating of Shavuot is only one issue. The second issue is, and we see that Onkelos was weighing in with the Prushim, right? Not only was Onkelos weighing in with the Prushim, Onkelos is just one guy who makes a translation. Onkelos is reflecting, obviously, the Prushim, the rabbis in the Talmud, and we're going to see more of that, and Philo and Josephus. Philo, who was the famous Greek commentator out of Egypt, Jewish, writing in Greek, commentator on all things Jewish, in his commentary makes it clear Shavuot is supposed to be the 6th of Sivan, that you translate Mimacharat HaShabbat as the day after the first day of Pesach. And Josephus, who was a Kohen at some point, and then went on to hang out with the Romans, he writes that it's supposed to be celebrated on the 6th of Sivan. So obviously it was a mainstream approach to do it on the 6th of Sivan. The question is how that happened. What was why was this such a distinct machloket and pervasive machloket? But it doesn't answer the question. And maybe if we do answer this question, it will help us understand it. What is Shavuot about? So we have reasons for. So I added another source. I actually just wanted to look. Hold on one second. I added another source to the WhatsApp. So I'm going to stop sharing so that people at home can now see my WhatsApp. And this is another little interesting thing. So I talked about how the custom to read the 10 Commandments on Shavuot was not clear cut. First of all, there was nothing in the Torah that said that Shavuot had any connection to Matan Torah, and on top of that, there is a controversy about reading the 10 Commandments anytime outside of reading Parshat Yitro. So there's a double whammy then with reading it on Shavuot. Why are we reading on Shavuot when there's no clear connection? And the second thing is, should we really be reading the 10 Commandments? There's another controversy that happens again on Shavuot, which is there's also a big push in the Talmud and in various debates amongst the rabbis that we should not be including Yechezkel, the book of Ezekiel, in the Tanakh. And we've talked about this a couple of months ago. We talked about this a few months ago because there are Psukim and Yechezkel for the rabbis. Everything in the prophets, everything in the Nevi'im had to match up with halacha. And there are a few Psukim and Yechezkel that really don't. So at some point, Yechezkel is talking about some korbanot. I can't remember what it was. Julie would remember, but I don't think she's here. There's some discussion about some korbanot, and Yechezkel completely omits it. Okay, and so the rabbis felt uncomfortable about this. Well, get this. Okay, let's look at and I didn't write down where this was from in Yechezkel. I'm sorry, I forgot to write down what parak it's from, and I can't remember. On the 14th day of the first month, you shall have the Passover sacrifice, and during a festival of 7 days, unleavened bread shall be eaten. This is from Yechezkel, from Ezekiel. On that day, the prince shall provide a bull of sin offering on behalf of himself and the entire population. And during the 7 days of the festival, he shall provide daily for 7 days, 7 bulls, 7 rams, Go down to 24. He shall provide a meal offering of an ephah for each bull and an ephah for each ram with him to every ephah. So too, during the festival of the 7th month, for 7 days, from the 15th day on, he shall provide the same sin offering, burnt offerings, meal offerings, and oil. Okay, so what 2 holidays is Yechezkel talking about? What's missing? Okay, this was a huge controversy. So not only was Yechezkel omitting some things that upset the rabbis, this is a huge thing to omit. There's no reference in Yechezkel to the holiday of Shavuot. Okay, now do you want to hear the big irony? The big irony of the whole thing is that if you do show up in Shul, or if you're just reading from home, tuning in from home, what is the Haftorah for Shavuot? It's from Yechezkel. It's the Maaseh Merkavah, which in itself is quite controversial, but the whole chariot, whatever prophecy. So the rabbis are like, we shouldn't include Yechezkel in Tanakh because it skips a lot of important things. And then the irony of the whole thing is that very prophet that sort of conveniently forgets about Shavuot, that's the Haftorah that we read on Shavuot. So what's going on? How can Yechezkel, he knew his stuff, like, what happened to Shavuot? What happened to Shavuot for Yechezkel? Why doesn't he talk about Shavuot?
You only had 2 hands.
He was in Babel.
Yes.
Okay, so he was in Bavel. So what does that say about it? So is that what Shavuot is about? That's the bottom line. So is Shavuot merely a celebration? According to the Torah, Yechezkel is right. Because according to the Torah, what is Shavuot? Shavuot is a celebration of the harvest. Well, if you're in exile in Bavel and you don't have, you don't have land, you're not landed, you're slaves to the regime. So what purpose does Shavuot have? I mean, although they are celebrating Sukkot, but what purpose does Shavuot have? We know in the Torah that you're going to celebrate Pesach no matter where you are, right? It celebrates the Exodus from Egypt. It doesn't matter if you're in Bavel, you're still celebrating the Exodus from Egypt. Exactly, wherever you're living. And then what does Sukkot celebrate according to the Torah? It celebrates the fact that the Jews were able to survive in booths during those 40 years in the desert, that God protected them. That's something that's universal. That's virtual Judaism. Pesach and Sukkot are virtual Judaism. You can celebrate them even though Sukkot is associated with bringing in the sheaves. Even though Sukkot is tied to some agrarian celebration, it's still associated with something from our history. It's still associated with Jewish history. So those 2 holidays are portable. And going back to Laura's question about a 3rd Beit HaMikdash, this is Yechezkel, while he's remonstrating the people for causing their own expulsion and for causing the destruction or the impending destruction, he is already setting the stage for a virtual religion, for a religion that's global, that can be celebrated anywhere and everywhere. It's not set in the land.
And he clearly didn't know what to do with Shavuot. There was no tradition of celebrating Shavuot outside the land because Shavuot is a celebration of the land. In fact, if we go back, sorry, I have to stop share. If we go back to our sources, back to sharing them. If we go back to our sources, if we look at Vayikra, this is the only time in the Torah that we get some sense of where Shavuot is coming from. It says, if you look at that at source number 3, Daber el bnei Israel v'amarta lahem ki tavo el haaretz, when you come to the land. So we're getting a sense from the Torah that Shavuot is a celebration of the land, a celebration of the land. Now,
There's almost nothing in Talmud Bavli about the laws concerning the land.
right, exactly, because the rabbis were contending with Laura's question, which is, do we need a Beit HaMikdash? Obviously, the Talmud is full of discussions about what to do in the Beit HaMikdash, but the question about can Judaism be celebrated without a Beit HaMikdash or without a land was already something that Yechezkel was contending with, centuries before. So
when it says when you enter the land, does that turn it on for all eternity? So if you come and go, you still do it, or is it only when you're in the land? Right.
that's a really good question. That's exactly right. So clearly, now let's try to understand that question in light of the fact that the rabbis were so insistent. Why were the rabbis so insistent? Why couldn't the rabbis have gone with the pshat? The pshat seems pretty obvious. The text says, count from the day after Shabbat of Pesach 7 weeks. Why couldn't they go with that? Why were they insistent that you translate Shabbat as Yom Tov, which, by the way, there is no other example of translating Shabbat as Yom Tov in the Torah. So it's a really exegetical stretch. Why were they so insistent that this happened that way? And I want to give you a picture of what the tension was like. And we'll do this in English. This is the 4th source. This is from Menachot. And how would they perform the Omer? Emissaries, so this Omer that they did on the day after either Shabbat or the day after the first day of Pesach, right? Like either way, according to this, it's going to become clear how it was done. How would they perform the Omer? Emissaries of the court emerged on the eve of the festival, right? It makes it very clear. In the Hebrew side, Beit Din Yotzim Erev Yom Tov. Okay, they showed up on Erev Yom Tov, not on Shabbat, not Erev Shabbat, Erev Yom Tov. They would show up in these various towns and fashion the stalks of barley into sheaves while the stalks were still attached to the ground, so it would be more convenient to reap them. The residents of all the towns adjacent to the site of the harvest would assemble there so that it would be harvested with great fanfare. There are a lot of descriptions in the Mishnah about how beautiful, 7 weeks later, how beautiful the Bikurim was. Like even a year before the destruction of the temple, you have images of these oxen laden with flowers. And I mean, imagine the Midrachov, Erev Shavuot, with all the tractors and everything. And on a full country scale, like everybody's celebrating, bringing all their Bikurim to Jerusalem. It was like, that's 7 weeks after what we're talking about here. So all of this was great celebration. Would assemble theirs. While the stocks were sold, the residents of all the towns adjacent to the site of the harvest would assemble there so that it would be harvested with great fanfare. Once it grew dark, he says to them, did the sun set? So it's now Yom Tov. Did the sun set? They say yes. He says, did the sun set? They say yes. He says, shall I reap the sheaves with the sickle? They say yes. He says, with this sickle. They say yes. He says, in this basket. They say yes. He says, in this basket. They say yes. If the 16th of Nisan occurs on Shabbat, the court emissary says to the assembled, shall I cut the sheaves on this Shabbat? They say yes. He says, this Shabbat. They say yes. He says, shall I cut the sheaves? And they say to him, cut. He says, shall I cut the sheaves? And they say to him, cut. He asks 3 times with regard to each and every matter. And the assembly says to him, yes, yes, yes. The Mishnah asks, why do I need to this extent?
It is due to the Baitusim, the Bethusians, as they would say, there's no harvest on the Omer at the conclusion of the first festival. Okay, so here's a huge polemic on behalf of the Prushim and the rabbis. Basically, they would send their beitin to every town in the country, and they would basically establish that the counting of Shavuot was the counting of the 7 weeks leading to Shavuot was always going to be on the day after Chag. And why did the beitin Shaliach make them repeat and repeat and repeat? It was to remember and to establish it. And the Mishnah is very, very clear. This was a polemic against the Baitusim, against the Sadducees, against the Qumranim. Nobody cared about the Qumranim, but whatever, they're still in the background. And to say there's only one date for this holiday. So, yeah.
You said that Shabbat never means Yom Tov, but is there anywhere else in the Torah where we say do something after the day of Shabbat? Like
Mimacharat HaShabbat. I mean, I only know it from here, but that's because that's what we say with the Omer. I would have really good question. Have to look it up. Really good question. Remind me. Let's look it up afterwards. Okay, remember our favorite Megillat Tani? Do people remember what Megillat Tani is?
remember we discussed it.
What? The day when you don't fast. Exactly. You're amazing. It's the days that you don't fast. What kind of text is it? Do you remember? What kind of text is it? Is it a Hillel text, a Shammai text? It's definitely a Shammai text. And it basically, why don't we really know about it anymore today? Because it's really tied into the spirit of the revolt, the spirit of fighting for the Beit HaMikdash, which the Shammaites were very loyal to. Like they were a lot of them, as we've seen through this class, a lot of them ended up jumping joining the revolt. And this text was a Shammai text. Remember, it was written in an attic, and it was all the days that we don't fast, mainly because of victories over Romans and Greeks. It started with the Chashmonaim, but remember, there's the day that you don't fast because Caligula was about to set a statue or a statue of himself. He wanted Agrippus to put a statue of himself in the Kodesh HaKodeshim, and then right before it was going to happen, there was a note that came that Caligula had been assassinated. So that becomes one of these days. Another day, one of the central days, is the 8th of Nisan. Okay, and why the 8th of Nisan? And let's do it in the English. And the English is not as good as the Hebrew, but the Hebrew is like long, and I don't understand some of it. So we'll stick to the English. Because the Tzedukim, and here, Ve'ezazo Atzeret, what is the Atzeret? What is the occasion? Now, I want to point out another thing, and it's probably too much information, but Shavuot, I told you, it's never referred to in the Talmud as Man Matan Toratenu. It's never referred to in that way. It's always referred to as Atzeret. It's always referred to as the occasion. And that reminds you of Shmini Atzeret, right? So Shmini Atzeret is the end of Sukkot, and in the Torah, it is not considered to be one of the Shalosh Regalim. You're probably still in Jerusalem because you came for Sukkot, and it's like an extra day in Jerusalem, but you don't have to be in Jerusalem for it. It's not central to the celebration of Shmini Atzeret. So a lot of commentators say that just like Shmini Atzeret is 7 days after the first day of Sukkot, Shavuot is the Shmini Atzeret of Pesach. It's the last bit of celebration for Pesach. And that's their understanding of why the Torah doesn't give a lot of explanation for it, because it was just meant to be an Atzeret. It was just meant to be an occasion. Okay. So that's just another perspective on it.
Yeah, it's
Yeah. So that it wouldn't be considered what, I mean, it's confusing because the Torah clearly considers it to be one of the Shalosh Regalim, but it also would explain why Yechezkel skips it. Because you know,
Is that
he's
also considered the end of Pesach?
yes, exactly, like the end, just like Shmini Atzeret is the end of Sukkot, exactly. So v'halo lo nitzruchu lichtov kol hayamim tovim shebemegillah. Why did we didn't need to write this all down? Why is this such a special day? Because the Sadducees said that Shavuot is always on a Sunday. But Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai went among them and said to them, "From where did you learn this?" So we know where they learned it. It's in the Torah, right? But none of them were able to bring a proof from the Torah except one man who was babbling opposite him and said, because Moshe was a lover of Jews and he knew that Shavuot was only one day. So he said, let's make sure it always is on Sunday so that they can get 2 days of celebration back to back.
Sounds like one day. That's funny.
And it's Memorial Day weekend, right? And so Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, in the Hebrew, it goes through a whole description about how Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai tries to prove to them that Moshe didn't really love the Jews, and they're like, oh, maybe he didn't. And then they're like, and then he ends with, "You incredible fool, our perfect Torah is nothing like your pointless chatter." Okay. Now this is a really interesting, and I'll stop sharing here because I think this is a really interesting piece of, first of all, by the way, it doesn't matter. It's going down a rabbit hole if we don't need to go down. But this is a really interesting polemic, right? This Tzedukim and the Baitusim, they clearly had a reason for keeping Shavuot on Sunday, right? It makes sense with the Torah, with the pshat of the Torah. And yet, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai says, "What's your proof?" And they're not able to give a proof. They're not able to say what it is. And any of us in this class would right away say, but it says Mimorchat Shabbat. Now, either the text is trying to prove something ridiculous, it's another polemic against the Baitusim by saying they're not even smart enough to figure out what's going on, and they don't understand that they don't know the pshat. So it's even like they're keeping something and they don't understand why they're keeping it this way. But is there something else going on? What is the response? The response is, we want to have, Moshe liked us and we want to have 2 days off. Okay. Who are the Baitusim? Who are the Baitusim? Who are the Sadducees? What do we know about them economically?
They were the rich.
They were the rich. Why were they rich? Because they had land. They had land. They were the landowners. Okay. So for them, if they've just done the harvest, what do they want more than anything? 2 days off.
Oh.
Now, if you're one of the Prushim, if you're one of the rabbis, do you need 2 days off? No, because you don't have land. You're not celebrating this agrarian aspect of the holiday. You're it's a regular chag, and that's it. But Rabbi Sachs actually, and I'll share Zev's article and I'll share Rabbi Sachs' article on this. And I think Rabbi Sachs ends up quoting Professor Daniel Elazar from Bar Ilan, who has this perspective on the whole thing. Why are the rabbis so insistent that Shavuot have an independent date, okay, an independent date, and a meaning, right? So through the Talmud we see that there was a very strong tradition that Shavuot was related to the giving of the Torah. And remember, in Masechet Brachot, there's a whole discussion about whether what was the giving of the Torah on Shabbat, because then could you walk? There's a whole discussion about when it actually happened, like the actual day. But the rabbis are really, really interested in connecting Shavuot to Matan Torah. It makes sense calendar-wise. Why does it make sense calendar-wise? Because we know that the Torah was given according to the Torah. Matan Torah was in Sivan. So if you have this holiday in Sivan, why not connect it to? And there always was this tradition floating around of connecting it to Shavuot. Okay. But why was it so important to the rabbis to do that? So when we talk about Beit HaMikdash and we talk about land, and Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai we just had in this source, and he was the one who tried to make Judaism as portable as possible. There's an understanding throughout, from the time of the destruction of the first Beit HaMikdash, and we saw when Ezra came back to the land of Israel, there's a celebration of land, but there's also a celebration of the portability of the Torah, and that we are not just a people connected to a land, we're a people connected to history.
So for instance, we still keep Tzom Gedalia, right? Not everybody. Why should I fast for Gedalia? Gedalia didn't fast for me, but Tzom Gedalia is in our calendar. Tzom Gedalia is in our calendar. And what is that connection to us? It's a Judean Jewish governor that was assassinated. Why is it in our calendar? Because we are a people of history. And the giving of the Torah, the central aspect, needs an anniversary. You can't just say that it happened and you don't mark the occasion. So Shavuot became the tradition of keeping Shavuot as the celebration of Matan Torah is essentially about marking one of the most important moments in Jewish history, marking it for all time so that we don't forget it. And every holiday and every anniversary and every occasion is marked to something historical, not just to land. This was an oral Torah, that this was a Prushi, a rabbinic response to the idea of Judaism as a whole. We do need the land, we do need the Beit HaMikdash, but we can exist virtually without it. The Sadducees they weren't just stam keeping Shavuot, right? They were keeping it as a celebration of the harvest. They were keeping it as getting a long weekend, a Memorial Day weekend, like let's have ta'anug, let's have rejoicing. But the Sadducees also, despite how they turn out in this text with Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai looking pretty silly, the Sadducees were also celebrating something. What were the Sadducees celebrating? They also saw it as a celebration of something. So according to Professor Daniel Elazar, they are celebrating Yom Ha'atzmaut. They are celebrating coming to the land. If we remember when we looked at Vayikra, when is Shavuot relevant? It's relevant when you come to the land. When you conquer the land, you will start bringing your Bikurim, and you will celebrate the fact that you've been given this land, the fact that you've conquered and you've been given this land. So who is that a big celebration for? People who own land, right? People who are part of the state. As we've seen throughout the class, the Sadducees and the Kohanim who were associated with them, they were friends with first of all, they were the Chashmonaim. And then when the Chashmonaim lost power and the Romans took over, they were the ones who were closest to the emperor. They were the ones who were closest to the governing class. When we looked at the Kamsa Bar Kamsa story, that whole story was about who was prominent in the governing circle, and those were the Tzedukim. So the land is a huge part of who we are, and that's what they're celebrating with Shavuot. So with Shavuot, and the complexity of setting a calendar, it's not that the Tzedukim didn't have a calendar, it's just they didn't agree on where the emphasis of the calendar should be. The Prushim saw it as history. Our calendar marks history because that's what's going to take us into the next century when we don't have land and we don't have a Beit HaMikdash. That's what's going to help us survive as a people. And the Tzedukim said everything that is about Judaism is about Israel and the Beit HaMikdash. And without them, we're not Jewish. And so both sides saw the importance of Torah, both sides saw the importance of land. The question is where they put the emphasis.
So in Parshat Tavor in Barim,
that's where the Bikurim are, yeah.
you have that
Arami Oved Avi.
Bidyuk, and that's the historical context.
Yes.
It doesn't appear in Vayikra.
It doesn't. It only appears in Kitavo, and it isn't even in Kitavo. I have to look back. I don't know that it's no, it is in Kitavo. Right. Does it give the rules for Shavuot there? Does it say 7 weeks? It just says when you bring your Bikurim. It kind of is sitting there. But what Sarah is referring to is the passage from the Haggadah that says Arami Oved Avi, and my father was a wandering Aramean, and then the Haggadah goes and deliberately misinterprets it as some story between Yaakov and Lavan, when clearly the story is either about Abraham crossing Ebron Nahar, or it's about Yaakov going back to Canaan. So we don't know who it's referring to exactly, but every single person who reaches the land of Israel needs to, when they bring their Bikurim to the Kohen, and the Kohen lifts it up, needs to say this script. It's a very unusual set of psukim because we don't have any other scripted performance in the korbanot. You give the korban, and there's some korbanot the Kohen lifts, some that he doesn't lift, and some you shech, some you don't shech. There are lots of laws, but here you actually say a declaration, and every single person, it could be someone living right here today, says the same exact thing, even though they had no connection to it's centuries and centuries after the Exodus from Egypt, but yet they say their history. They say every single one of them adapts their history. And so I think that that's a very nice connection with the Tzedukim, right? Because the Tzedukim are saying this is part of our history, and every single person who brings this korban says this part of history. But then the rabbis have a response, right? They put it in the Haggadah. And so without the Beit HaMikdash, we're still saying it. We're each of us saying those psukim, even though they truncate it, but we're still saying each of those psukim. So it's a nice microcosm of the machloket. And the machloket goes on today, right? It's happening right now. What is more important to being Jewish? Is it Israel and some future Beit HaMikdash? Because there's they're the people who say, the people who are post-Zionists, right? It's about Israel, the land, and it doesn't matter if Torah is involved or not. And then there are the Zionists who say it's about land and Jewish history. And then there are the Chardalians who say that it's about land and settlement of the land and eventually a third Beit HaMikdash. And then there are the Haredim who say, and secular Jews, the Haredim who say it's just Torah and not state. And then the secular Jews who are like, I shouldn't say that, but yeah, I'm talking about specific ones in America, not here. Anyway, so you see how Shavuot, is this, and we didn't even get to why there's a Tikkun Leil Shavuot, but you see how it sort of developed in this confusion about dates, the conspicuous lack of details in the Torah about what it is, and that how really going back to Laura's question about whether a Beit HaMikdash is important or not is really central to how the holiday is interpreted and how we end up interpreting it today. And especially now, like we're back in Israel, you notice that Shavuot has again become an agrarian holiday with milkies. Yes, exactly. So I'm going to stop the recording now.